Good afternoon, everyone. What we're going to do over the next few sessions is answer this question: are children reliable witnesses? And which is the title of a book I have, which sums up the literature on this. My main area of research and expertise is children's eyewitness testimony. My master's project and doctoral research was on how children's temperament plays a role in police interviews. And I've worked with police and courts in the UK and in the US on evaluating children's testimony. So I'll tell you a bit about my own research over the next few sessions and maybe also some cases that I've worked on. But by the end of it, you'll be more aware over just how involved children are in the legal system. And we've already spoken about eyewitness testimony, but we'll narrow in on the differences to do with children and how to best get reliable accounts from children and factors that can impact descriptions and identifications. And then we'll talk also about individual differences, suggestibility, and how juries also respond to child witnesses. So let me just kind of give you a scenario, first of all, to imagine. Maybe a small boy, maybe around 6 years old, is at the park with his mother and a little sister. And maybe the mother is pushing the little girl on the swings, and the boy sees some of his friends in a nearby field kicking around a ball, and he asks if he can go play, and she says, yes, sure. And then maybe on the way, he's stopped by a strange man, and he begins talking to the boy and says that he has the jerseys in his van of the boy's favorite team, and asks the boy if he would like to come with him and maybe get one of these jerseys. And maybe the boy's been warned about going with strangers, and so he refuses. Maybe the man tries to take him by force, but maybe the boy manages to get away, and he runs to his mother and cries for help, and then she calls police. What will happen next is that the police will take a description from the boy. They'll see if there's anyone nearby who matches this description, perhaps anyone seen by other witnesses, anyone who lives nearby, who has a criminal record of, criminal histories to do with crimes against children. Ideally, there will have been some other witnesses whose accounts can maybe be put up against the boys to make sure that they're in agreement with one another. And maybe a suspect is identified, and then the boy is asked to pick out the perpetrator from a lineup. And then maybe he picks out the suspect correctly, and then maybe we go ahead to trial. But perhaps there is no other witnesses. Perhaps the boy's account is the only evidence that there is. How would we realistically expect a jury to respond to this? If this young boy's account is the only evidence being presented over someone's guilt. There's a lot of important questions here to consider, especially because when it comes to crimes against children, their accounts usually are the only evidence that's available. So can we actually expect a boy this young to describe the events accurately? Can we expect him to pick someone out from the lineup correctly? And if we go to all the effort and time and expense of putting together a trial, do we actually expect a jury to convict based upon only a young boy's account and nothing else? Again, important because remember, eyewitness testimony is the leading cause of wrongful imprisonment. About 75% of wrongful imprisonment cases involve eyewitness testimony. And as a generalization, children perform worse than adults on facial recognition tasks and remember worse, or remember less rather, than adults do as well. It's a difficult balance. I can give you plenty of examples of such cases that fall within this category. One would be Ricardo Rochelle. A young boy in his neighborhood went missing and was raped by the kidnapper. And then when he was found, he was walking down the street with his mother. His mother pointed to Ricardo and said, "Is that the man who abducted you?" And the boy said, "Yes." Now, Ricardo had a scar on his face and a deformity from an injury, and he was known to the boys in the neighborhood. They would share stories and rumors over how he got this disfigurement. And the man was arrested and he was convicted based purely upon the boy's testimony, nothing else. He claimed his innocence and even claimed the actual perpetrator was a man called Andrew Hawthorne, who was a known serial rapist in the area. But only through help of the Innocence Project did he manage to prove his innocence and that Andrew Hawthorne was actually the perpetrator. On the other side, not too long ago, there was a teenage girl in France who claimed her father was sexually molesting her. The police said that her account wasn't enough to act upon, and so she set up a camera in her bedroom and filmed the next sexual assault, and only after having that evidence did police then act and arrest the father. So, if we believe children without question, it means that innocent people might go to prison. But if we don't allow them to give testimony, okay, then it would mean that justice won't be seen and that, dangerous offenders continue to walk the streets. Particularly a difficult balance because, like I say, in these cases, the children's word is quite often all that there is. Sexual abuse claims are only really taken seriously about 25 to a third of the time by parents and teachers, despite the fact that only about 6% of sexual abuse allegations by children are believed to be false, both in the UK and in the US. A movie on the issue I recommend if you haven't seen it with Mads Mikkelsen called The Hunt. He plays a daycare worker and a girl at the daycare accuses him of sexual touching. Now, unlike similar movies on the topic, we see from the beginning that he's innocent, and we even see how she's been led astray and how the idea that she's been touched has been suggested to her and why she makes this account. And we see that the town turns against him based upon the word of this girl, because the general reaction is that children don't make up allegations such as this. If we look at the history of children in the legal system, the evidence of child witnesses goes well back in Europe. Even the earliest court records and transcripts we have from the 1500s included children giving testimony. But things were very, very different here in the US. Canada didn't, and Canada, I mean North America in general. Canada didn't enact its first act allowing child witnesses until 1893. The US didn't do so until 1895. Before this, children did not give testimony, largely as backlash against the Salem witch trials and other well-known instances in which children were known to make, inaccurate witnesses. Today in the US and in the UK, there's no minimum age requirement. It's up to the judge to decide whether the child is competent enough to give testimony, and this is done on a case-by-case basis. So in the US, the judge has to decide two things. Does the child know the difference between fact and fiction? Do they know the difference between a truth and a lie? And the judge will determine this by asking some simple questions. Is Mickey Mouse real or not real, right? Not real. Well, they know fact from fiction. If I said my shoes were red when my shoes are black, is that a truth or a lie, right? And if the child doesn't answer correctly, first of all, the judge might ask follow-up questions, okay? But ultimately, it's up to the judge's discretion on whether the child is competent and whether they know the difference between fact and fiction, truth and lie. A case I worked on over the summer in Georgia last summer involved a 2-year-old girl who was the only witness in a case of sexual abuse. So children as young as 2, okay, and there's other cases like that too, in which children that young have given testimony. In the US, about 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused. The number is likely an underreport because majority of people don't report sexual abuse. Some studies suggesting as little as about 38% do so. This is the crime children are most victim to, however, sexual abuse, the crime that they're most likely to give testimony to if they're giving testimony in courts. But they could give testimony over other issues as well, including domestic violence or even spousal homicide, okay? Over 15 million children witness domestic violence every year, okay? In regard to how many children give testimony, I gathered stats on that for various countries during my doctoral research. It's not possible to do so for the US because a lot of the information such as this isn't kept on a database that's nationwide and that's shared, but it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands, okay? But even looking at the estimates that there are over how many children every year give testimony in US courtrooms, it's actually less than half proportionately of Western Europe. In part because in Western Europe, some countries like Scotland say that evidence has to be corroborated by other evidence if it's to be presented at trial, whereas there isn't a restriction like that in the US. But also in part, I believe, because the US is more skeptical still over child witness testimony. And again, this might be part because of stories like the Salem witch trials. I'm sure you're familiar with this case, but I'll tell you a little bit. 1689, Abigail Williams, 11 or 12 years old, is sent to live with her uncle, the Reverend Samuel Parris, in Salem, Massachusetts. Her parents have just been killed by Native Americans on a raid in her town, an incident that was clearly traumatic for the young girl, but she's told to earn her keep at her uncle's home by doing the chores and looking after her sick aunt. There isn't much to do over the cold winter months, but stories about fortune telling and magic are pretty popular at the time. And in the evening, she forms a circle with her cousins and some close friends, and they share what they've heard from stories. And this nicknames them the Circle Girls. And one night, they decide to tell each other's fortune by cracking an egg into water and seeing how the yolk forms. And not entirely sure how it came to this, but Abigail Williams wasn't really happy with the fortune that was foretold to her, and she began acting out pretty strangely, saying words that really didn't make any sense. She wasn't coherent to the Reverend, running around the house and distorting her body into weird shapes. The Reverend called the local doctor. He inspected her. He couldn't find any physical reason for her disturbance, and so claimed that it must be because of supernatural forces, that she had been possessed by witches. And so the Reverend grilled the young girl over who had possessed her, who had bewitched her. And eventually she revealed the name of the Reverend's slave, Tituba. This young woman was then grilled, interrogated, possibly beaten by the Reverend over other witches in town and whether she was a witch. Eventually she confessed and also gave the names of two other women, Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. These two women's standing in town wasn't very high, and so they were kind of prime candidates for witches, if you like. One had refused to go to church any longer, which was a no-no at this time in this town. One was a homeless woman who was known to curse under her breath when people didn't give her charity. And the girls were grilled further over other witches, and eventually over 200 names of people in town were given. They were mostly arrested. 19 of them were even sentenced to death and killed, one by pressing to death, the others by hanging. And the reception eventually began to change. The public opinion eventually began to shift. There was crop shortages and starvation, and the opinion was that maybe they were being punished by God for killing innocent people. And so eventually the charges were dropped and those who were still locked up were released. And the Reverend was never able to win back public favor, and he pretty quickly after this left town. And then there's some disagreement between historians over what happened to Abigail Williams. Some claims that she died during the trials. Some claim that the Reverend sent her away because he blames her for the town's misfortune. And this was the last time that anyone was killed in the US for being a witch. The Circle Girls eventually began to say that they felt as though they had been pressured into giving these accusations during the time. And the taking of 19 innocent lives, I'm sure, took the toll of all involved for a very long time to come. Now, in fact, something very similar happened here in modern history. You know, the witch trials, the witch hunts are not something of ancient history, but are much more recent than many people realize. And what I'm referring to here is the hysteria over satanic, ritualistic sexual abuse occurring in daycares across the US in the 1970s and the 1980s. That many of you probably haven't even heard of, okay? But this was a bizarre incident that resulted in hundreds of people being convicted and sent to prison for satanic, ritualistic sexual abuse in daycares across the US. Despite the case that not one incident of satanic, ritualistic sexual abuse and daycare has ever been proven in the US, ever, okay? All of these people were eventually released from prison and the charges overturned and dropped. These allegations were bizarre to say the least, okay? That the daycare workers would organize the children into the satanic shapes, that they would force them naked, that the daycare workers would fly on broomsticks and wear witch hats when the other adults weren't looking, that they would take the children through secret tunnels under the daycare to a secret farm where they would sacrifice animals on the farm, that they would sacrifice babies to a sea of sharks in a sacrifice. And despite these bizarre claims, hundreds of people were sentenced to prison. The general opinion from interviews with juries were that, well, not all of it could have been correct, but some of it must have been correct because children don't just make stuff up, okay? The hysteria was so widespread that it eventually spread from the US to Canada to South America to Western Europe and even as far as New Zealand, okay? Again, cases of these satanic, ritualistic sexual abuse. In fact, the children were not just making these up, okay? As we'll see, children don't really make up claims of sexual abuse on their own, okay? What was happening here was a product of hysteria. What happened in the 1970s was that women were going into the workplace in numbers like never seen before, and they were having to leave their children with strangers, which previous generations hadn't done. And the demand for daycares was like never seen before. They were opening up everywhere, including in people's homes, people's basements. And there was paranoia over leaving one's child with a stranger to look after them. To add to this paranoia, there were conferences being held all over the US, run by district attorney offices and social workers, telling the parents on signs to look out for. Does your child not want to go to daycare? That might be a red flag. Maybe they're being sexually abused. Are they wetting the bed? That might be a red flag. Maybe they're being sexually abused. If you see any of these red flags, send them to a therapist, not to any therapist, but to our therapist who works with the district attorney and who works with the social workers and who are specialized in these cases. So of course, these are vague red flags. Many children are reporting such things. Many parents are then reporting these and sending their children to these recommended therapists. And the therapists are asking incredibly leading questions about sexual touching, giving them anatomical dolls to point to where they've been touched. As we'll see, all of this is suggestive in nature. And once the child makes an account to the therapist, even a vague account, the therapist goes to the police, and then the police start a formal investigation. We knew nothing at this time about how to appropriately interview children, and the approaches by police, we can say now, were terrible, okay? Once an accusation had been made, the police interrogated those children to get an accusation. The children were denied going to the bathroom until they told police what the police wanted to hear. They weren't allowed to go to their parents until they told police what they wanted to hear. The police used peer pressure so-and-so told me this, so-and-so told me that, all of your friends have told me it. You don't want to be left out, do you? They were given rewards, toy police badges, and made members of the department, according to police, if they told police what they wanted to hear. And the questions were highly, highly suggestive, okay? It's not surprising that based upon these suggestive interrogations, children eventually told something that could be used in a criminal trial, okay? Thankfully, we've come a long, long way, okay? We know now how to better interview children, what questions to avoid, what questions to ask, how formats or how interviews should be formatted, rather, with children. What I want to play with you is a news segment from the 1990s in which the tide was really beginning to turn. You know, what I want to have you realize is that up until the 1970s, no one really knew much about children's testimony because they didn't give testimony. You know, it wasn't until the 1970s that there were then concerns over sexual abuse and so on that children then began giving testimony. Okay. You know, questionnaires at the time tell us that the majority of parents at the time, the majority were concerned over satanic, ritualistic sexual abuse occurring in daycares. You know, given that only 2 decades before, people thought that sexual abuse was something that never happened, it's an unbelievable transformation in public opinion. And then once these cases began in the 1970s, you know, the prevailing opinion initially was that children won't make these things up, that they can be trusted. And then once all of these cases began getting overturned and the people involved were getting declared innocent, the public opinion changed really by the mid-1990s, okay? And people were then much more skeptical over children's testimony. But by this point, we had researched it. You know, the research really began in the 1980s in this field. And by the mid-1990s, we had a kind of better idea on how to interview children.
It is not necessarily.
Now, there's no question about it. Some children will always tell the truth, and child abuse is a reality. But what researchers are proving is that some kids can
You all hear this, okay?
be influenced to make up and then actually believe stories that never really happened. And tonight you'll see this with your own eyes. As John Stossel reports, the findings could change the outcome of sexual abuse cases which rest on a child's testimony.
In Lowell, Massachusetts, Shirley Souza watches while her husband Ray tends his vegetable garden. Looks like a normal suburban scene, but the Souza's life is anything but normal.
There's a half a dozen cucumbers.
My phone's ringing.
Several times a day, the phone rings because the State Department of Corrections wants each of them to face the camera attached to the phone.
Shirley Souza, 285 Princeton Boulevard, Lowell, Mass.
The Souzas are prisoners in their home. They're under house arrest. It's part of the 9 to 15-year sentence they received for molesting their 2 grandchildren. The first charges came in a letter from the district attorney.
I came home from work, and I walked in, and Raymond said, I wasn't going to show this to you, but you better look at it. And I couldn't believe it. When I looked and I read it, I just...
Can you imagine myself or any human being putting their head in a vagina, or sticking toes there, or touching different places, or putting a fist up their anus? It just wouldn't make it. Wouldn't there be some sort of serious damage? Wouldn't you notice right away?
Every year, thousands of people like the Souzas are convicted of child abuse, even though there's no direct physical evidence. They're convicted simply on the word of 4- and 5-year-old kids. Conventional wisdom is that kids that age wouldn't make such things up. They simply don't know enough about sexuality to come up with detailed accounts of sexual abuse. But then Cornell University professor Stephen Ceci read the testimony of some well-known molestation cases and concluded that interviewers had led the kids on by asking suggestive questions. The interviewers could say, how else can we get this information out? Because the kids won't volunteer it.
The problem is that from a research standpoint, we are now discovering that if you put kids who were not abused through the same kind of highly leading, repetitive interview, some of those children will also disclose events that seem credible, but in fact are not born in actuality.
Now, others have suspected this, but Cece decided to test that theory. He set up an experiment known as the Sam Stone study. He told a classroom full of 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds that a man named Sam Stone would come to their class and that he was very clumsy. Then the man came in, stayed a few minutes, and left. That's it. He didn't do anything clumsy. Then, 4 times in the next few months, half the kids were asked leading questions about the man's visit.
Do you remember when Sam Stone came to the school and he broke that toy? Did he do it on purpose or was it an accident? Well, he didn't break a toy. So it's highly suggestive, erroneously suggesting questioning.
After that, another interviewer simply asked,
I wasn't there that day, and I want to know everything that happened that day that Sam Stone came to visit. Can you tell me what happened?
This little boy said Sam Stone was reading a book during the visit to the classroom.
He was doing it so fast that he ripped one of the pages.
Really? Did he say
This girl said Sam Stone threw dolls and books in the air while he was in the class.
Well, when your teacher saw that he was throwing things in the air, what did she say?
Then you need to go.
You need to go?
Yeah, but keep on ripping our stuff.
Just asking leading questions inspired most of the kids to make stories up.
In real-life cases, though, are the investigators as suggestive as your testers are?
What we do is a pale version of what happens in real cases. It doesn't come close, for example, to what was done in the Kelly Michaels case.
The Essex County Prosecutor's Office says 26-year-old Margaret Kelly Michaels is a manipulative, sadistic child.
Preschool teacher Michaels was convicted of molesting 19 children, molesting them in bizarre ways, and in the middle of this crowded New Jersey school without any teacher or parent noticing anything. She served 5 years in jail until this year when her conviction was overturned by an appeals court that questioned the reliability of the children's testimony.
One day you're getting ready for work, making coffee, minding your business, trying to get along as best you can, being a reasonable, decent, honorable citizen, and the next minute you're an accused child molester with the most bizarre, I had never even heard of such things even being done.
They say you inserted objects including Lego blocks, forks, spoons, serrated knives into their anuses, vaginas,
and a
penises,
sword.
And a sword.
Yeah.
That you made children drink your urine, that you made kids take their clothes off and lick peanut butter off them. It's very hard to believe, yet the jury believed it, and not you.
No one is willing to doubt a child. And I think that's how the state won their case. They didn't have to present a credible case of how it could happen or recreate the scene of the crime or even presenting witnesses, but just they knew if they presented these little children saying, yes, Kelly was a bad person and she hurt me at this school, that no one would dare question that.
She has a point. This past decade has seen a skyrocketing number of molestation claims, often against family members like the Souzas and against daycare operators like McMartin in California and Little Rascals in North Carolina. All these cases are based primarily on the word of children who, after the fact, had repeatedly been asked questions like this.
Do you remember that time when Mr. asked you to stick his penis in your mouth? Okay.
None of the child abuse investigators would agree to be interviewed for this story. Some clearly go too far.
You're pressing your pee-pee against me, you know. It feels good when you do that. Maybe, is that what they did too?
Steve Cece says the questioning in the Kelly Michaels case was just as leading as this.
They say to the child, we want you to tell us what Kelly did. The kid says, I don't remember. Oh, yes, you do. You remember. No, I don't remember. You do so. We know you remember. At this point, the child's crying. I want to get out of here. You're not going anywhere till you tell us what we know you want, what we know you know.
Basically, we're barraged with questions and coerced, manipulated, begged, made to feel guilty. It just was disgusting.
But where would the kids come up with saying things like, she put the knife in my vagina, or she covered me with peanut butter?
Mm-hmm. Children have incredible imaginations, and it's not out of the realm. Anybody who is a parent who is honest knows what kids are capable of saying.
Ray and Shirley were astonished when they heard their grandchildren's testimony.
They said we used a machine as big as this whole house on them to violate them. We had a cage in the cellar that we locked them up. Never produced nothing.
But why would kids make such things up? That's what convinces juries. You hear those stories and you say, okay, maybe it's not all true. Maybe the machine wasn't as big as a house. Maybe Kelly Michaels didn't smear them all with peanut butter. Teachers would have smelled that. But there must be some truth to it. How could children come up with so many inventive, kinky activities and describe them with so many details unless something really happened? It's a persuasive argument until you hear about Cece's next experiment. He had researchers ask 4- and 5-year-olds to pick a card out of a deck of 10. On each card was a question.
Okay, Derek. This one says, have you ever seen a baby alligator eating apples on an airplane?
No.
No? Have you ever had your finger caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital?
No.
No? Your class?
At first, almost all the kids say no.
Mm-mm.
But then, once a week for the next 10 weeks, they ask the question again. No coercion, no leading questions, as in child abuse cases. They just gently repeat the question.
You went to the hospital because your finger got caught in a mousetrap. Did that happen?
Uh-huh.
Yeah?
By week 4 or 6 or 10, most of the kids are saying, yes, it happened. And not just saying yes, but giving such precise information about it that you'd think it must have happened.
Did it hurt?
Yeah.
Yeah? Who took you to the hospital?
My daddy, my mommy, my brother.
So where in your house is the mousetrap?
It's up at our, down in the basement.
Down in the basement. What is it next to in the basement?
It's next to the firewood.
Anyway, what you see here is a child who's giving you a lot of perceptual detail. He's telling you where the mousetrap was. It was next to a wood pile in the basement. He had gone down there because he wanted to tell his dad, who was down there collecting firewood, that he was ready for lunch. He gets in an argument with his brother Colin, which he later goes on to describe. They were fighting over some action figure. Colin pushes him next to the wood pile. He doesn't see where his hand's going, and it gets caught in a mousetrap.
Were you surprised at the answers you got?
I think it's fair to say that my colleagues and I were absolutely shocked that by the 10th week, not only were they assenting to some of these things that didn't occur, but they were giving very coherent narratives, highly elaborated narratives that are, I think, quite persuadable.
By the time I met the same boy, it was weeks after the experiment, but he still could give lots of convincing details about things that never happened.
Was there a time when you got your finger caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital? Wow, which finger was it?
Remember, this is the result after a researcher simply asked the question once a week for 10 weeks. In real abuse cases, kids are questioned for years, often by parents, doctors, then by the investigator, perhaps a therapist, then by lawyers.
Who went with you to the hospital?
My mom and my dad and my brother Colin, but not my baby. He was in my mom's tummy.
Your baby
This boy's testimony is even more remarkable because just a few days earlier, his father had discussed the experiment with him. He'd explained that it was just a test and the whole mousetrap event had never happened. The boy agreed it was just in his imagination. Still, listen to this.
Let me ask you, did your father tell you something about the mousetrap finger story?
No,
Is it true? Did it really happen?
A story.
It
really happened.
It's really happened? You really got your finger caught? It's really happened?
Yeah.
I assume the child isn't lying. They aren't intentionally making up stories.
Absolutely. I think they've come to believe it. It is part of their belief system.
Some experts believe they'd come closer to the truth using anatomically correct dolls. With dolls, they wouldn't have to ask so many questions. But Cece's colleague, Dr. Maggie Brooke, conducted tests that led her to conclude using dolls also leads kids on.
I would think anatomically correct dolls would be a good, neutral way to ask questions.
I thought the very same way, but after having had this experience, I'm not quite sure how you do that.
Brooke had this pediatrician add some extra steps to his routine physical examination of preschool kids. He measures the child's wrists with a ribbon. He puts a little label on the child's stomach, and he tickles the child's foot with a stick. Never does the doctor go anywhere near the child's private parts. Then, right after the exam, using an anatomically correct doll, Bruck asks leading questions about the doctor's exam.
Can you show me on the doll how Dr. Emmett touched your vagina?
No, he didn't.
He didn't.
The child tells the truth. But just a few days later, Dr. Bruck and the child's father again ask about the doctor's visit. It's a different story. Before Bruck has a chance to even bring out the doll, the child shows how the doctor had strangled her with the ribbon.
He put that around your neck? Like that?
Tight. So tight.
And watch what happens when the doll's brought out. She's asked to explain what the doctor did that day.
So what did he do?
Put a stick in my vagina.
He put a stick in your vagina?
Yeah.
Just like that?
It gets even more violent. She claims the doctor hammered the stick into her vagina. Then she shows how the doctor examined her.
He looked where?
My honey.
He did look in your hiney?
Of course, none of it is true. Dr. Bruck found that when dolls were used, half the kids who'd never had their private parts touched claimed the doctor had touched them. These tests make Dr. Bruck question some of the recent testimony by children in court.
Do you think there are dozens of people in jail now who are totally innocent?
Yes, I do.
The researchers' findings are only beginning to be heard in courtrooms. Most prosecutors still argue that children wouldn't lie. Prosecutors want to put Kelly Michaels back in jail. In a few months, they plan to retry her with the same charges.
I will fight to the end because I am an innocent woman and I can look anyone in the eye, and if I have to fight to the rest of my life, then I will do that. So I'm prepared for whatever will happen.
You don't sound scared.
No, I'm not scared. I'm angry and I'm outraged. But I'm not scared.
The Sousas are planning an appeal of their own. Like Kelly Michaels, they believe a day will come when the courts and their grandchildren realize the truth.
When those kiddos grow up, when they become adults, they're going to realize that these things never happened between Shirley and I and them. And I know that they're going to realize that. They're bright children, and they have a mind of their own. And when nobody's prompting them, when they grow up, they can remember and will embrace.
Well, John, you know, I remember I first worried about this sort of thing after some of the early cases that we reported. But children can be so convincing. How do we separate out when they're telling the truth from when they're not?
There is no good way. There are all kinds of experts who will testify in court as paid expert witnesses, and they often say they can tell. But Dr. Ceci ran a test where he showed them tapes of kids, some of whom were lying, some were not. And the experts would say, oh, I can tell. But what they said was wrong half the time, in fact, more than half the time. So they did worse than chance.
Clearly, there are real cases of sexual abuse of children, and we have to address that.
Yes, and Dr. Ceci won't testify on behalf of the defense because he's afraid he'll let a real molester off because of this. But it's important not to influence the children, and Ceci says to test an alternative hypothesis. In other words, to ask the child, well, Joe did this to you, and then what did Jane do to you? If the child starts talking about more people, then at least you have a reason to be suspicious.
Thank you, John.
Well, next.
So this was really then the beginning of realizing that asking suggestive questions to children isn't the best approach. And by the late 90s, we had then interview formats developed, to help guide investigators on what are the best ways to interview children. And by the mid-late 90s, we had answered then some of these big questions like, can children provide accurate accounts? What's the best way to interview them? What's the questions to avoid? The research is still ongoing, and there's still always improvements and recommendations newly being made. But the questions being answered now by the research are more micro. They're, what's the role of temperament? And do children understand temporal questions, questions to do with how long ago something happened and the sequence of events? and how to best ask those sorts of questions. Okay. There's a whole range of cases here I can't go into detail in the lecture, but I've put up a book chapter on Canvas that goes into these cases in more detail if you want to know more about them. You know, the McMartin case is still cited as the most expensive criminal case in US history, over $15 million of the public taxpayers' money spent, ending in all of the charges being overturned. So, you know, the issue at heart here is the issue of suggestibility. Something that we've talked about already, right? It refers to suggestion, and then through either the influence of psychological or social cognitive factors, someone then given into that suggestion and changing their account so it's in line with what's being suggested to them. Now, we gave a number of examples before, such as the Lost in the Mall study and other examples of people being led by suggestion. But, you know, most of those were not really under traumatic experiences, if you like. You might think if it came to a criminal event, one would be less easily led astray, okay, because what happened was incredibly important, right? But we have evidence that argues that even under times of severe stress, people's accounts of that can still be led astray through suggestive questions. So the study by Morgan and Loftus and colleagues from 2013 used US military personnel as participants. Now, these participants, as part of their training, have to go through an interrogation stimulation that is stimulating or simulating what would have happened if they were taken captive overseas by the enemy, and making sure that they won't give away any crucial information, that making sure that they can endure hours of intense interrogation. And then afterwards, as part of the experiment, they were asked leading questions about things that they had seen in the interrogation room, and through suggestion, they gave false reports. That's over objects in the room. Maybe you might think, well, they're paying more attention on the interrogator. They're looking at this interrogator for a long period of time during a highly stressful event. And even through suggestion, they can be misled on what the interrogator looked like, their hair color, whether they had facial hair or not, what they were wearing. Even these accounts were made inaccurate through suggestion. And the bottom study here, we have children who are receiving a vaccine. Some of them report being extremely anxious, some of them much more on the lower end of anxiety. And actually those on the higher end of anxiety were more easily led astray by suggestion over what the nurse looked like and objects in the room and so on during this event. Now, interestingly, in this study, the impact was mediated by the child's attachment style. If the child had an anxious attachment style, okay, then it was the case that the more anxious they were more easily led astray through suggestive questions. If they had a more secure attachment style, they were more kind of persistent or resilient, if you like, to suggestive questions. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a future session, but you know, some evidence that individual differences matter. Not all children will respond in the same way. Now, what's interesting is that research on children's testimony wasn't really done in the US or in the UK until about the 1970s. But actually, in continental Europe, there had been a wealth of knowledge already gathered from Belgium, German, French psychologists as far back as the late 1800s. Even ideas like autosuggestion, you know, it's only in the past couple of decades that researchers in the US and the UK have begun to make the distinction between false memories that are a product of suggestion and false memories that are spontaneous and are a product of autosuggestion. But there's a paper as far back as 1900 from continental Europe that makes this distinction. And these are not unknown psychologists. Binet is one of the primary developers of the IQ test. Stern was one of two co-authors who brought about the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology, one of the most cited journals that there is in the psychology field. It was just the case that these particular papers had never been translated into English, and so British and American psychologists weren't aware of this research. And so a lot of the initial studies being done by American and British psychologists were actually repeats of studies that had already been done in continental Europe. So the studies by Binet, for example, one study was a study of autosuggestion in which children were shown a series of lines getting progressively longer until they stopped getting longer and remained the same in size. But the children continued to report them getting longer, okay, because the pattern that they were identifying, okay, was kind of skewing their perception. And then in other studies, they were asked misleading questions over objects in the room, and some were asked open-ended questions, and unsurprisingly, those who were given misleading questions or questions about objects not in the room, they gave more inaccurate details than those who were just given open-ended questions. Now, interestingly, when followed up on and asked, are you sure about your accounts? The children in the auto-suggestion study were able to doubt themselves and think that maybe they had actually been inaccurate, whereas the children in the misleading study remained confident, okay, in the inaccurate details that they had reported. So at least from this study, suggesting that suggestion has more of an influence on tainting future accounts and autobiographical memory than auto-suggestion does. In the study by Stern, we have more evidence over the impact of suggestive, misleading questions, and also evidence over the impact of stress. In one study, they had two Confederates walk into a classroom. One of them pulls out a gun, toy gun, okay, and this is during the time when studies weren't so, scrutinized by IRBs, right? So you could actually do studies like this. And what they found was that memory accounts declined over what was said and what happened after the gun was pulled out. So as stress kind of peaked, this is when memory then became impaired. And Stern found more evidence over the impact of misleading questions, but also grouped children by age and found that the younger they were, the more easily led astray they were by the misleading questions, the more vulnerable they were to suggestion. The older they got, the less vulnerable they were. Vardenock's interesting because it's probably the first case in which there were psychologists giving testimony at court over a child's testimony. A young girl called Cece had been out playing with two friends, and then a strange man had led her away, and then her body was found. She had been killed. And so the two girls that she was playing with were interviewed over what the man looked like, who he was. He was obviously the prime suspect. And then eventually a suspect was identified based upon their descriptions. And there was a lot of psychologists in this Belgium trial giving testimony over how accurate the girls likely were. But Vardenock really stands out above the rest because he had done a number of research studies before the trial, and then quite theatrically during the trial produced the results of the research studies that he had done. And the participants in the studies were the same age as the two primary witnesses. So in one study, for example, he had a man walk into a classroom, and then he spoke to the teacher briefly and then walked out. And then the children afterwards were asked, tell me the color of his beard. Okay, it's a suggestive question, okay, because it's suggesting that the man has a beard. In fact, he had no beard, okay? But more than 80% of the children give a false report, okay? They answered this with a color that was obviously incorrect because he had no color, he had no beard. And another study, another man walked into the classroom, again, had a conversation with the teacher. He's wearing a hat, he wears the hat all the while, he never removes it. But again, the children are asked, at what point did he remove the hat? Okay, it's a suggestive question again. And this time again, more than half of the children gave some response that was obviously inaccurate, that at this point in the conversation, he removed his hat. Now, Valdenok claimed that children were just inherently inaccurate and just shouldn't be allowed to be witnesses, which isn't what Binney and Stern argued. They argued that children could be trusted so long as open-ended questions were used and misleading suggestive questions were avoided. So Stephen Ceci from the video was really one of the first American psychologists to begin researching in this field. In 1995, he and Maggie Bruck, also from the video, published a book called Jeopardy in the Courtroom, which was really like the end of a chapter. You know, it was a big book containing everything we knew about children's eyewitness memory up to that point. They really summed up the literature, and it's still quite an authority. It's obviously a bit outdated now, but for a long, long time, it was cited in trials and in courts and relied upon by judges as guidance on how to treat child witnesses and whether a child is accurate or not. And really was, you know, the end of a chapter because it was summing up a lot of these big questions on how accurate children are. And one of the most notable studies was mentioned in the video, known as the mousetrap study by Stephen Ceci. And so there's 96 children, all 3 to 6 years of age. They're read a list of events that never happened. And then over a series of 10 weeks, they're asked again every time they go to this session once a week for 10 weeks, whether these things happened. Okay. There's no interrogation or highly suggestive questions like in many other cases. They're just being asked again and again, did these things happen? Okay. And as you saw in the video, children began reporting a number of these things having happened. Okay. More than half reported at least some of them having happened. But the mousetrap was the most common. 43% of them, after 10 interviews, said that they had got their hands stuck in a mousetrap, even though they'd never had. And on the first session, admitted that they never had. And as you saw in the video, not only did they say they had, but they gave coherent, elaborate narratives over how it happened, where they were, who was there, who took them to the hospital, and so on. And when challenged afterwards with the fact it was all part of an experiment, it never happened, they continued to believe that actually it was something that was true. Okay, it actually did become a part of their beliefs, their autobiographical memory. The younger children, 3 to 4, were more vulnerable to this than the 5 to 6 year olds. Okay, more likely to believe this false belief. It's a source monitoring error, again, which I told you about a few weeks ago, right? When you're not able to identify the source over a piece of information. You know, for these children, most likely they were generating an image over getting their hands caught in a mousetrap when asked about it. And then 10 weeks later, when being asked about it again, they were remembering the mental representation, okay, rather than an event, obviously, because such an event never happened. Another well-known study is the Sam Stone study that was also mentioned in the video. Now, when Ceci began doing this research, you know, he was getting contacted by judges over advice, and one such example which led to this experiment was a young boy whose his mother had disappeared when he was young, about 4 years old. His father didn't want to look after him, and so the boy went to live with his aunt. And then a few years later, the boy's mother's body was discovered in the backyard of where he used to live. And his father was the primary suspect. And so, of course, the aunt begins asking the boy questions. Did you ever see your father be violent with your mother? Did you ever see him hit your mother? Did you ever see him carry her to the backyard? Okay. And what the judge wanted to know from Stephen Ceci was, could these questions from the aunt be enough to take the boy's testimony? Because initially he said he saw nothing. Eventually he said, yes, he saw his father kill his mother and take her out to the backyard. So the question the judge wanted answered was, you know, was the boy saying this just because of these questions being asked by the aunt? You know, she's kind of inducing into him this negative stereotype, this negative idea that his father might be capable of terrible things. At the time, Ceci said he didn't know enough to give the judge helpful advice. But he then did this study, seeing what the impact might be of prior knowledge of stereotypes. So in this study, some of the children are given false stereotypes about Sam Stone being clumsy before Sam Stone visits the classroom. So Sam Stone, he's such a clumsy clown. He's always making a mess. He's always dropping things, okay, and so on and so on. And then the children await the arrival of Sam Stone. Sam Stone arrives into the classroom. He does nothing clumsy. He's there briefly. He talks to the teacher. Nothing very noticeable or notable happens, and then he leaves. But afterwards, some of the children are asked suggestive questions over clumsy things Sam Stone has done, and some are asked completely neutral questions, just tell me what happened. So there's two independent variables here, right, in 4 groups. One independent variable is the stereotypes beforehand. One independent variable is the questions. So there is a group of children who receive both the negative stereotypes and leading questions, a group who receive neither, and then a group who receive just the leading questions, and a group who receive just the prior stereotypes. Unsurprisingly, the group who received both the leading questions and the negative stereotypes were the ones most likely to report that Sam Stone had acted clumsy and give elaborate details that he had been throwing papers around the classroom and dropping books and making all sorts of messes. Okay. So the conclusion for Stephen Ceci was that yes, actually, this sort of prior knowledge or negative stereotype can cause these sorts of accounts, which happened in many cases in the daycare cases. Parents would hear stories and then they would say to their children, so-and-so says that the daycare worker hit them or did this, okay? Tell me, have they ever acted in a way horrible to you, and so on. So, the power of suggestion is real. We spoke about some studies in the eyewitness testimony lecture on how college students had false memories implanted over being lost in a mall as children, nearly drowning, being attacked by a bear. Some other events, hot air balloon ride that never happened when they were children. And then some more extreme, being abducted by aliens when you were a child. But in these 2 studies, there's 2 groups of participants. There's the college students again, and then there's children, okay? And the children were much more vulnerable to having these false memories implanted than the college students were, okay? More vulnerable to the influence of suggestion. So why is it that children are more led astray by suggestion than adults? Why is it that they're more vulnerable to this? One reason is that children are generally compliant and agreeable. So they generally want to please adults and perform in the way in which they think is expected of them. And, in many of these interrogations and interviews, they would pick up on what the adult wants to hear, and then that would influence their future accounts. We know that there is a degree of compliance because in lineup procedures, okay, even when the child knows that their answer is incorrect, they might still give an incorrect answer. And the only then possible explanation is some social factor such as compliance. So what I mean by that is in a study, for example, they gave a lineup to a child or children containing the children's favorite cartoon characters. Okay, so maybe it's, from SpongeBob SquarePants, and you've got, Squidward and SpongeBob and Patrick and so on. And you tell the child, pick from the lineup Patrick, okay? If Patrick's actually in the lineup, accuracy is 100%, okay? Because in the sample, they all know who Patrick is. They all are familiar with this cartoon. So success is 100%. But then if you remove Patrick from the lineup and ask children, pick Patrick, a significant number give a response, okay? They know it's inaccurate because they know that Patrick isn't there, okay? So they're still giving a false report. In that case, it would seem that they feel compelled to provide a response because they think one's expected of them from the adult. And this would also help explain why they answer close-ended questions even when they don't understand them. In some cases, like what's heavier, red or yellow, young children, like 4 or 5, will answer these sorts of nonsensical, ridiculous questions. Children remember less than adults. And so if you remember less, you're going to be more easily led astray by suggestion. You're going to doubt your own memory more and rely upon someone else's account more so if your memory is less strong of an event, right? I could suggest to you that this date is your birthday, okay, again and again and again, and probably find it very, very difficult to lead you astray, okay, because the memory over when your birthday is one that's pretty strong, okay? But maybe through suggestion, I could much more easily have you falsely believe that an acquaintance's birthday is a different date, because the memory for that's much less strong, right? Similar to this, if your knowledge over an event is weaker, you're going to be more easily led astray by suggestion than if you have a good amount of knowledge on a subject, okay? So in some studies, if we give children a briefing on a topic and some children don't receive that briefing, the children who don't receive it are much more vulnerable to suggestion than those who get the knowledge, okay? And if we're talking about sexual abuse, then obviously this is a topic that children don't know much about. And so they are going to rely upon the adults, and they are going to be more easily confused, and they are going to not understand everything being asked of them as well. And so language differences also here matter, because we know that high language skills are one of the biggest protective factors over suggestibility. If a child has a particularly advanced language ability, they're much less vulnerable to suggestion than the typical child is. If you are a young child, you have less words to express yourself, okay? You don't know as many words, so you're more easily confused by what's being asked of you. And so again, you're more easily led astray by suggestion. Now, the last one's more theoretical and not tested, but possibly own age bias. We spoke about own race bias before, which has been well tested. The idea here is something similar, that children, especially if they're in school or in nursery, they're spending their time with children their age, okay? And so they will be better, in theory, at identifying faces of a similar age rather than of a different age. And of course, most offenders are going to be adults. But are children always less accurate than adults? Are they always more suggestible? I kind of gave you some insight into this a few weeks ago. I told you, yes, children are more vulnerable to external suggestion, but in fact, they're less vulnerable to autosuggestion or to spontaneous false memories. So I gave you the list experiment by Rogiter and McDermott, right? And you, or a number of you, falsely believed that the word sleep was on the list. And I told you that adults have this issue, but children really don't, because they're less likely to have an idea on the theme that's emerging. They're less likely to rely upon prior knowledge or stereotypes or something else that might have them spontaneously create a false memory. Already this is having implications in courtrooms. Nearly 10 years ago now, I guess, in the Netherlands, there was a teenage girl called Vicky, not her real name, and she was at home with her mother and father, and she heard an incident from the bedroom, and when she went into the bedroom, she saw her father killing her mother, and then she called police for help, and police came to the door, and she told them immediately what had happened, that the father had killed her mother. The defense claimed that eyewitness memory is not very accurate, especially children. You know, because of all of these studies, maybe she's been led astray. Maybe she created a false memory of her father killing her mother when actually it was someone else. The prosecutor put on the stand Henry Utgar. Okay, now Henry Utgar is one of the primary researchers in the field of autosuggestion. Okay, remember the name for the exam. Okay, so what Henry Utgar found was that children are less vulnerable to spontaneous false memories than adults, less vulnerable to autosuggestion. I told you about this study, for example, in which children and adults were shown the video of a bank robbery, but there was no weapon involved. And the adults were more likely to falsely report the bank robbers having a gun, probably because of previous stories or movies and TV shows they had seen of bank robberies, and that they usually contained a gun. So Henry Utgar gave testimony and told the jury about all of these studies that we know about, telling the jury that actually it's unlikely that Vicky would be vulnerable to autosuggestion and would spontaneously come up with a false belief that it was her father, because she, without suggestion, told police at the door that her father had killed her mother, okay? And then immediately in a police interview told them the same in detail. So there was no time for post-event information or impact from suggestion. She didn't have interviews with family beforehand or anything such as this, okay? Just a little bit left, okay, before we finish. So if we want to know whether children make good witnesses as in court, maybe some questions to ask are, for example, do they answer nonsensical questions? Because I told you before that young children often do. So this comes from Hughes and Greaves, and then replication by Pratt. We have children given, again, ridiculous questions like what's heavier, red or yellow, and as high as 90% in response to some of these questions, giving a response. But these studies are only finding this result in response to close-ended questions, okay? So what the future researchers found, like Amanda Waterman, was that if you asked open-ended questions, even if it was nonsensical, ridiculous, the child would not respond to this. It would only be if it was a yes or no or sort of close-ended option posing question. Furthermore, Waterman and Mark Blades found that if you instruct children to say, I don't know, if you don't understand the question or know the answer, then this also would significantly limit the number of ridiculous questions that would be answered by the children. And in the formats that we use now for guidance for police, these instructions are used, okay? Telling children, if you don't know the answer, you should say, you don't know. So another really important question might be, if a child is a witness in a sexual abuse allegation case, will they claim to have been sexually touched when they haven't? Okay, and this was touched upon in one of the studies in the video. These are obviously very difficult studies to do, but a fairly well-known one from 1991 has 5-year-olds and 7-year-old girls, and they're going to a pediatrician for an appointment. They're getting one of two examinations, okay? One are getting a spinal examination, checking for a curved spine, so the doctor is only touching their back. The other group are having a genital examination, okay? Now, the children are asked abuse-related questions about sexual touching and non-abuse questions such as objects in the room and things the doctor said. Now, only one of the 5-year-old children out of 71 made a false report about these abuse-related questions, okay? So from that, not very likely to claim to have been abused when haven't, from that one example. Now, that's just in response to free recall, okay? What about asking more interrogative, suggestive questions over touching that hasn't occurred? So the children in the genital condition are asked about having been touched on their back when they weren't. The children in the spinal condition are asked about genital touching who were never touched in that area. 3 out of the 35 said that they had been touched anally or vaginally. Even after a month, okay, they responded incredibly accurately to these sorts of questions. Much more in the other group claimed to have been touched on their back when they hadn't. So again, this would tell us that children are not likely to claim to have been touched in these sorts of areas when they haven't. Importantly also, the children who had been in this condition, who had been touched there, were incredibly hesitant to reveal so. Only 8, so 22%, and 4, so 11%, admitted to having been touched vaginally and anally, respectively, when they had in response to free recall. When given more interrogative, suggestive questions, the number goes up, okay, to 86% and 69%. But that still means that there's more than 14% here of children who have been touched and who would never claim to have been touched, even through interrogative, suggestive questions. Okay. Okay, afternoon, everyone. So continuing on with this question of whether or not children are reliable witnesses, something we touched upon at the end last time was that it would seem in medical procedure studies that children cannot easily be led to say they've been sexually touched, or won't, rather, on their own accord, volunteer that they've been sexually touched if they haven't been. And even if they have, some children are very hesitant to reveal so, which is another point we'll come back to. Despite the fact that they are vulnerable to suggestion, and if it's planted in their mind, especially through repeated interviews, then they're frequently victim to believing things that didn't actually happen. But on that point, that if without these sorts of suggestions, if children will not easily volunteer that they've been sexually touched, perhaps because of feelings of guilt, shame, perhaps the offender, if it's a sexual abuser who's regularly abusing them, perhaps they've convinced the child that it's somehow the child's fault what's happening, or the child will be blamed, or the child will be looked negatively upon if this is to come out. What do we do about this? Well, as you saw in the video, one idea is anatomically correct dolls. Having children play with these dolls, seeing how they react to the dolls, seeing how they point out, if they do point out anything on the doll. The issue here is that they're suggestive in their very nature, right? And also there is no clear pattern to how an abused child should play or behave with this doll. Okay, there's no discernible difference between how an abused child and how a non-abused child. And trained professionals can't tell the difference between an abused child and a non-abused child based upon how they interact with this doll. In part because there's individual differences. Emotionality comes into it. Some children are more rough in their play by nature, or more boisterous, more prone, especially if they're very young, to physical aggression and so on, and so might play aggressively with the doll, regardless of whether they've been abused or not. Other factors impacting disclosures are, of course, if the abuser is a family member, the child might fear consequences over being abandoned, or might misunderstand the relationship, might fear what happens if news comes out about the offense. And age is another factor, okay? Younger children are less likely to volunteer these sorts of details over sexual touching than older children. One proposed answer to these issues is the putative confession technique by Evans and Loynes. Now, the idea here is that if you tell the child so-and-so has already confessed, okay, then the child doesn't have to worry about being responsible, okay, to the same extent, because the person's already confessed. It's no longer a secret, okay? Because in some cases, the offender might have convinced the child that it's a secret that needs to be kept between them. They may have told the child that if you tell anyone, I'll hurt your family or I'll hurt you, okay? So the child might be fearing the consequences of this coming out. Now, so far, this confession technique hasn't been tested in abuse scenarios because it's only been tested in experimental designs. And so, of course, that would be too difficult. The experiments are, for example, in the one here, the child is at a summer camp and a Confederate plays with them on a video computer, and then the Confederate accidentally destroys the laptop, okay? And they tell the child, it's our secrets, okay? Don't tell anyone, okay, that I destroyed the laptop. And then the children are interviewed in a kind of police-like scenario, trying to get them to admit to the Confederate having destroyed the laptop. And some are told the Confederate confessed, which is the putative confession technique, and some are not told this, okay? And those in the experimental condition with this confession technique, they're more likely to come forward and tell the experimenter that the Confederate destroyed the laptop. Now, obviously, the ecological validity here is weak, okay, because we can't mirror the situation over sexual abuse, right? The crime, if you like, itself is obviously not anywhere near as severe, and the potential consequences also are not going to be the same, okay? So if we're talking about children's reliability as witnesses, one important question might be, well, what's their accuracy when it comes to describing? Okay, so remember that first part of the eyewitness experience is being interviewed by police and describing the perpetrator and what happened. Again, similar to with adults, here is the most frequently and accurately reported descriptor, followed by clothing. And just like with adults, children are better when it comes to describing exterior features like hair color than interior features, okay, like the eyes and the nose and so on. Now, well, that's also true for adults. The difference is even more extreme for children, okay? Children are even worse comparatively with the interior features than adults are. Some other differences are that children are less likely in free recall to give estimates over heights and weights, okay? This might be part of a adult's description, okay? It's not really too surprising that young children won't volunteer this sort of information because, you know, your understanding of height and weight comes with experience, right? So quite often the investigator might have to probe for this information. They might have to say, you know, was he taller or shorter than me? Was he taller or shorter than, you know, your mom? Was he taller than shorter than this officer? And then try to use that to get some sort of estimate. A young child themselves is unlikely to just give some estimate over height or weight. Now, adults typically remember around 7 descriptors, which is something we talked about in the eyewitness lecture. So again, this could be, you know, hair color, eye color, piece of clothing, so on. Young children are more likely to remember 1 or 2. So we're talking here about 5 to 7 years old. And then older children, about 10 to 14, more like 2 or 3. So again, memory does improve from childhood to young adulthood, okay? Again, in these sorts of experimental designs, you know, the participants are watching a video or a live mock crime is occurring in front of them. So in one of the studies, the children are on a field trip to a fire station, and then a non-violent robbery happens in front of them, okay, outside the fire station. And again, the younger children remembered about 1 or 2 descriptors accurately about the perpetrator. Now, that's as a generalization. You know, there are some cases in which children might remember much more than they seem to in these experimental designs. It differs from case to case. You know, in many cases, children's testimony are needed for convictions. I can give you a case example in Brighton, England. There was a man called Russell Bishops. He was the main suspect from killing 2 little girls in the 1980s, okay? He had led them out to the woods and then sexually assaulted them and then strangled them to death. And while a jury had found him not guilty, the police still believed him to be the main suspect. And then in 1990, in a similar location, a young girl called Rachel W. was out roller skating, and she roller skated past a red car with the trunk open, and someone grabbed her and then threw her into the trunk and then closed it and drew off to the Devil Dykes woods. And there she was sexually assaulted, and then she was strangled until she was unconscious and left for dead, the perpetrator thinking that she was dead. But she survived, and she was discovered by some hikers. And her description was incredibly detailed, okay? She described the car color. She described the contents of the trunk, tools that had been inside the perpetrator's trunk. She described the hair color, the clothing of the perpetrator, his facial hair, and other facial characteristics. Based upon the similarity of the crime and based upon his description, Russell Bishop was, of course, the prime suspect. And while he denied it, Rachel pointed him out of a lineup immediately without hesitation. And all of the tools that she described being in his trunk were there. The clothing she described he owned, and he had the same facial hair that she described, and so on. Okay, so this descriptive evidence was highly influential or highly persuasive. And then based upon this, they were able to do DNA testing, and DNA as evidence proved that he was the perpetrator. And then he was held there thanks to Rachel W.'s testimony. And then double jeopardy laws were eventually overturned in England, and then he was retried for the former 2 killings in the 1980s, and then found guilty of those as well. So the next question is how accurate children are at identifications. Okay, so if there is a suspect, how accurate are they at identifying that suspect from the lineup? Now, in target present lineups, so that means when the perpetrator is actually there, okay, when the target's actually present, young children as young as 6 are just as accurate as adults, okay? That means an average success rate of 60%, okay? That's the average for adults and for children in target present lineups. The problem arises when the perpetrator is not there or the target is not there. In these situations, children are significantly more likely to make a false identification than an adult is, okay? Now, there's a number of possible reasons for this. It might be because their memory is weaker, so they're more easily convinced by someone who looks a bit like the perpetrator, okay? Or it could be because they are somewhat compliant, going back to that social compliance factor that we talked about. And I told you about this study, but in studies in which they're asked to point out the cartoon character in target present lineups, 100% accurate, okay? In target absent lineups, if we remove the cartoon character, we then get some false reports, even though they surely know their report is wrong because they know the cartoon character and so on, okay? So there is a degree, it would seem, of social compliance, okay, that they feel compelled to give an answer. But again, these accounts from children in many cases are highly crucial. You've maybe heard about the case of Elizabeth Smart from Salt Lake City in Utah. It's a fairly well-known case and has a couple of movies and so on made about it. But she was abducted from her bedroom, from her bed in the middle of the night. And the only witness was her younger sister, Mary Catherine Smart, who observed the abduction, the man taking her out of the house. Elizabeth was around 14, if I remember right, and the younger sister was around 6. Now, the description by Mary Catherine Smart was not detailed at all. There was only a few descriptors, and it would turn out those descriptors weren't correct either. And the story kept changing, and the police no longer really treated her as a reliable witness. But then 6 months later, she suddenly remembered the perpetrator. He had been doing some handiwork at the house. Apparently, the book she was reading jogged her memory because she may have been reading it at the same time he was there doing the work. The man, they said, was called Brian Mitchell, so the family told police. The police were not very skeptical, but nevertheless, they put out a search for Brian Mitchell. And sure enough, he was found with Elizabeth Smart. And so there's numerous cases such as this, okay, in which, the testimony from young girls is really what solves the crime. But nevertheless, in target absent lineups, on average, they're more inaccurate than adults are. One possible way to overcome this that's been suggested is by including a silhouette card or a mystery card. So that would be a silhouette like this with a question mark. And you tell the child, if you don't recognize anyone, then point to this, okay? That way the child doesn't feel as though they're disappointing the investigator, they're still providing an answer, okay? It's not like they're failing the test, okay? Because in my own studies too, and eyewitness research, what I find is that the children, they really want to prove themselves, they really want to do well when they see that there's some sort of task or test being put in front of them. So what the research tells us, and this has been tested here in North America and in the UK with young children and with adults, with older children rather, is that by including this silhouette card in target absent lineups, false identifications go down, and there is no negative impact on positive identifications during target present lineups, okay? The biggest benefit comes to younger children, okay? So just as an example, we have the controls here who have no silhouette card, and then those who are given a silhouette card. False identifications are the lighter blue in the target absent lineups, okay? We see about over 70% false identifications, okay, by young children in this. That's a large number of innocent people potentially being incorrectly identified as the perpetrator, where it goes down dramatically to less than half of that when the silhouette card is introduced. In target present lineups, when the perpetrator is actually there, okay, again, positive identifications. This is with young children, so it's, you know, less than 50%, but it's still around 50%, even with the silhouette card, okay? And it's been shown again with older children and in the UK setting and in North America. You know, in North America, as you should know by this point, there's usually a photo array, right? They're given photos and asked to pick out a photo that they remember. In the UK with children, the situation is similar. It's a bit different. They're shown a video instead, and the video shows the perpetrator from multiple angles, so from each side and from the back and from the front, and then it moves on to the next one and the next one. And it's like a sequential photo array. You know, after each one, they're asked, do you remember this person? Do you remember this person? Or rather, have you seen this person? And so on. Now, the first benefit to that, obviously, is that we're getting more perspectives. You know, we're getting more angles on the individual, so that might help with identifications. The other benefit, though, is that we're guaranteeing it's a sequential lineup rather than a simultaneous lineup, right? Because as we looked at before, in a sequential lineup, when you're seeing one at a time, the witness is more likely to be making absolute judgments, right? Is this the person or not? Is this the person or not, right? In a simultaneous lineup, we run the risk of them making a relative judgment. You know, which of these looks the most like the person, because they're viewing everyone at the same time and then picking out one particular answer. Now, as you saw, yeah. Yeah, so the question was on comparing a photo array to the video. I don't know actually any direct evidence showing that the video has better identifications rather than the photo array. Interviewing children then, you know, we looked at the fact last time that some of these early interviews with police were very problematic, right? There was highly suggestive questions. They were very interrogative in nature. There was a lot of interviewer bias. There was peer pressure used. They were denied going to the bathroom, denied getting access to their parents. There was the promise of rewards. There was a wide range of really problematic behavior. By this point, we now have interview formats to help guide police, and we have a lot more advice that we can give based upon evidence on how to conduct the best interviews. Now, during free recall, young children, even as young as 4, are just as accurate as adults. So a free recall prompt is just tell me what you remember, okay? Even a young child is likely to give highly accurate details to this question. The problem is those details will not be very detailed. A young child will probably only give 1 or 2 word responses in response to a question like this, okay? Whereas an adult witness is likely to give a much more elaborate answer up front. And if you have, you know, experiences with young children, you might be able to relate that to this, right? A young child is asked about what they did at school or over the weekend or anything like that. Usually it takes a bit of probing to get some elaboration. Okay. So follow-up questions are going to be needed. Now, follow-up questions are needed with every witness, but even more so with young children. And it's during this follow-up phase that problematic questioning might be used by police, because it's then that questions are more likely to be close-ended or suggestive. Okay. Now, if we break follow-up questions into types, the best types are open-ended prompts. Okay, so tell me more about that. Okay, or tell me more about this particular thing that you said. Okay, asking the child directly to elaborate on something that they said. So this would be a free invitation, or there could be a queued invitation. Tell me everything that happened between this and this. Okay, these two things that you mentioned. So this way, there's no close-ended questions. We're not restricting the possible answers the child can give. There's no suggestion. We're not leading the child in any way. We're only asking the child to give more details on points they've already said. Okay, we're asking them to elaborate on things that they've already told us about. And so these types of questions are the questions most likely to generate the most detailed responses and the most accurate responses. Okay. The next best type of question, if you like, are directive questions. So the WH questions like, you know, where did that happen? When did this happen? Who did this? How did this happen? Okay. These can also be open-ended depending upon how they're asked, and so long as they don't restrict the possible responses in any particular way, or they don't lead the child in a particular direction. And then we have option posing questions. These are usually yes or no, okay? So any question, you know, did this happen, for example, okay? But it could also be a question that poses options in another way. You know, was he tall or short? What room in the house did this happen in? Okay, something such as that. Now, these close-ended option posing questions, first of all, don't generate detailed responses, usually only one-word responses, okay? But also, they're increasing the chances that the child will give an answer, even if they don't know the answer or understand the question, okay? So they increase the chances of getting an answer, but overall decrease accuracy, okay? And then the worst type of question, of course, is suggestive questions, okay? Those that suggest information the child hasn't already said. So tell me about the sexual touching if the child hasn't mentioned sexual touching, or they lead the child in a particular direction, okay? So this would be a leading question. Now, in experiments, we know if the question is misleading, so leading in the wrong direction, or if it's correct leading in the right direction. In real life, investigators don't have this knowledge. They might think they do if they think they know who's guilty, okay? They might ask a question that's leading that they think is correct leading, but if the suspect is actually innocent, then of course it could be misleading, right? Or if nothing happens, then it's going to be misleading. Now, the experiment here is looking at actual transcripts with children from police interviews, and then coding, okay, the different types of questions that have been asked and how many of each type has been asked, okay? Now, this is the Achieving Best Evidence Protocol, which is the guidance in England and Wales, which tells the investigators to use a funnel approach. So begin with open-ended prompts, keep asking those open-ended prompts. Only if you're not getting anywhere should you move on to the directive questions. Keep asking those directive questions. Only if you're not getting anywhere might you move on to some of the option posing questions. However, what we find here is comparing after the implementation of these guidelines versus before the implementation of these guidelines, the different types of questions being asked aren't really changing. In both cases, over 40% are directive and over 40% are option posing. And we know these option posing questions are likely to be problematic, okay? Because some of these questions will have been answered without the child knowing the answer or maybe even understanding the questions. And in both cases, there's a small number of free invitations. Yeah. A much better protocol, the protocol that has the best evidence behind it, is the National Institute for Child and Health Development protocol, okay, the NICHD. It's the most widely tested and the most widely used. It's used in the Middle East, used in many parts of continental Europe, used in many parts of Asia, and it's the recommended format here in the US. It's not compelled upon investigators that they use it. Okay, there's no law that says this has to be the guideline that they use, but it's the recommendation that all investigators in the US use when interviewing children. Now, the NICHD protocol has a list of 7 stages, which is similar to another protocol called the stepwise protocol, which was used for a long time in Scotland and is used still a lot in Canada. And the stepwise protocol has these similar steps, but the stepwise protocol is just a list of steps, okay? The NICHD protocol is better because it's like a script that the investigator reads word for word. It's a couple dozen pages long. It guarantees that all investigators conduct the interview in the exact same way, and it removes the guesswork on the part of the investigators, you know, so them having to worry about what type of question should I ask, how should I do this, how should I go about completing this stage. It tells them exactly what to say, okay? So the list of steps are, first of all, introducing the reason for the interview, who the investigator is, and the rules, okay? The rules, because this scenario is going to be very unusual for the child, right? In a typical situation, the adult knows more than the child does, and if the child answers incorrectly, the adult will correct them. You know, what's the capital of France? And if the child guesses London, the teacher can tell them, no, it's Paris, right? That's the kind of interactions with adults they're used to. Also, if they don't yet have theory of mind, they won't yet understand that they know things that the adult doesn't, right? You all know what I mean by theory of mind, right? This is when the child is no longer egocentric, and now they understand that people have different views and different beliefs and so on. It's usually tested via some false belief task, right? So you give the child a scenario like Bob and Sarah are in the kitchen. Sarah puts the chocolate bar in the cupboard. Bob leaves, and then Sarah worries that the chocolate will melt. So she moves it from the cupboard to the refrigerator. And then Bob's hungry. He comes into the kitchen for some chocolate. Where does he look, right? A child who is 4 years old, who doesn't yet have theory of mind, who's still egocentric, will say the refrigerator, because that's where it is, right? Children who are 6, who have theory of mind, because they're now at this developmental stage, will say the cupboard, because that's where Bob thinks it is, because he didn't see Sarah remove it and move it to the refrigerator. So it's around age 5 that children begin to develop theory of mind, okay? So you have to explain the rules that you, the child, is the one who knows the answers, okay? Me, the adult, I don't know, okay? So if you don't know the answer to the question, just tell me you don't know. Don't guess. You have to tell the child not to guess. That's part of the rules, okay? Now, the NICHD protocol instructs investigators to test that the child understands these rules and to not move on until it's demonstrated that the child understands the rules. So it's not enough to just say, don't guess if you don't know the answer. You test it. And so the NICHD gives ways of testing this, okay? I have a dog. What's my dog's name? Okay? You don't know the answer, right? So if you guess, you failed that rule, okay? You haven't understood it, okay? So that would be a way of testing this with the child. Another one is making sure the child knows the difference between fact and fiction. We went over that last time, and understanding the difference between a truth and a lie, and making sure they know to correct the investigator if the investigator says something wrong, okay? So why the investigator say my shoes are black, okay, when they're clearly brown, okay? Does the child correct me? Again, if they fail this test, you retest them. That's what the NICHD protocol instructs. Now, sadly, what I find often is that the reality is investigators often treat this like a series of checkboxes, okay, that they have to tick this just because they might, be scrutinized if not. But what I often find is that if the children fail this, the investigators don't really go back over it, Okay, they might re-explain the rule, but they don't actually test correctly that the child understands the rule and is passing these tests. The second stage is building rapport. Okay, so we touched upon this before, that eyewitnesses are more likely to give information if the child feels as though they can open up and they feel trust towards the investigator. It's true also with adults, but it's true even more so with children. Okay, so this rapport building could be built by asking the child a series of questions about themselves. Tell me about yourself, and asking them about, you know, their interests and something such as that. The third stage is a practice interview or training in episodic memory. So this would be an interview over a neutral event. So usually it's a birthday or a recent vacation or an interest that was brought up in the rapport building. That's the kind of three most common topics for the practice interview. Now, what happens here is that the child gets used to what's happening, okay? That they're being given a series of open-ended questions and they're asking to elaborate and elaborate, giving as much details as possible, okay? So the investigator is getting the child used to the scenario. Now, what we find is in the actual forensic interview, we get 2.5 times as much information as we otherwise would by including the rapport building and training in episodic memory, okay? So it improves the amount of information we get and decreases overall the length of the interview, okay? Because it turns out that the children then give more elaboration initially to free recall prompts, and so less follow-up questions are needed. Problem is that investigators will quite often skip over this stage, okay? It's true here in the US, but also unfortunately true in the UK. When I was looking at a quality study, looking at transcripts, actual transcripts from investigators, okay, 0% of them did the training in episodic memory. 100% of them skipped over this stage, okay, across over 50 interviews. The reason investigators give are that they worry that the child will become exhausted, okay? They don't want to exhaust them too much, and it might take up too much time. Now, these concerns, as I've laid out, are actually misplaced, because actually we get more information by including this, not less, and the overall length of the interview is less, not longer, by including these stages. And then the fourth stage is transitioning to the issue at hand, okay? So tell me why you're here today, okay? Looking for the allegation of abuse or the allegation of the crime that's been committed. And then moving on to investigate this incident, again, using a funnel approach, beginning with these open-ended prompts, these cued invitations. Tell me what happened, tell me more about that, okay? And so on. And only once these are exhausted, moving on to the more directive questions, the when, what, where questions, and so on. And then the child is given a break, okay, so that they're not too mentally exhausted and they have some time to clear their head before finishing the interview. And then finally finishing up the interview by eliciting any further information that hasn't already been given, okay. Now, the NICHD protocol is well tested, okay? There are studies from Israel, from Asia, from the UK, from the US, that tell us that we get better questions by investigators by including this protocol, and that we get more accurate details from children by including this protocol. So there's a number of examples of this. I'll give you just a couple. So here in the UK, we have 50 interviews using the NICHD protocol, and then 50 interviews not using the NICHD protocol. Again, these are genuine transcripts from forensic interviews from the field with children. And again, we're coding the different questions, categorizing them according to the different type. So what we find is in the NICHD protocol, over 1/3 of the questions asked are cued invitations, okay, versus only 7% of the questions in the non-NICHD interviews. That's great, because those are the questions that generate the most detailed, accurate responses, according to the research, right? Directive questions are still fairly high, but again, these can be, beneficial so long as they're not leading or close-ended. Option posing is going down from 27% to 18%. Okay, again, that's a good finding because these might generate inaccurate details, and suggestive questions are remaining pretty low. Again, I could show you these studies for multiple countries, okay, but for just a couple of examples, here's one from the US. Again, we have non-NICHD protocols. Only 7% of the questions asked, again, are queued invitations. Problematic, because those are the best types of questions. And the NICHD protocol, again, a third of the questions asked are these queued invitation questions. Directive questions still fairly high. Option posing, in this case, fairly high. But the biggest benefit is that the queued invitation questions are going up dramatically. Now, you might think, well, that's all well and good if the investigators are asking better questions, but it's only really beneficial if the children are giving details in response to the questions that we're examining. So what we have here is how much of what the child told us in the interview was in response to each of these types of questions. So in the non-ICHD protocol, 14% of what the child told us was in response to queued invitations. But in the NICHD protocol, this is the UK study, over 50% of what the child tells us is in response to these queued invitation questions. That's great, because that means, that's 56% of the interview content that we know is very, very unlikely to be unreliable. From the research, it's highly likely to be reliable. Option posing elicited information going down from 23% to 10%. Again, that's a good finding, okay, because those contents might be questionable. And suggestion elicited information is also halving. Again, similar across studies, across countries. Here's the US, just to demonstrate. Invitation elicited information, again, nearly half, versus only 18% of the interview contents if this format isn't used, okay? Option posing going down by 10%, suggestive questions or suggestive elicited information, again, going down by half, okay? So overall, the NICHD protocol is the one that has the most evidence to back it, okay? Now, what you would think from the literature is that there is massive improvements here in the US, and there is, okay? The major cities here in the US are well trained in the NICHD protocol, okay? But most of the research comes from the same places like LA and Phoenix, places where this research is being done at nearby universities, and the researchers have good connections with the nearby police departments and so on. But since the NICHD protocol is only a recommendation, there are many places in the country, more remote places, in which the NICHD interview not only isn't used, but there's really no formal guidance used, okay? I go to a convention every year where this sort of research is discussed, the most recent research is presented. And something that was brought up quite recently is in some places in the US, when they've looked at the average number of open-ended questions used, okay? In one study looking at more kind of remote places in the middle of the US, the average was 1, okay? The first question was open-ended. Every single question after that was close-ended or leading, okay? So there are still some places where this research just isn't reaching the investigators, okay? And the interviews are pretty much as bad as they always were, okay? And even in places in which it is being implemented, not being implemented correctly, the case I was telling you about last summer in Georgia, that was using the NICHD protocol with this 2-year-old girl. She was free by the time of the investigation. But again, the rules, while being explained, were clearly not being understood, okay? And then moving on, the practice interview wasn't included, okay? what we find is that for investigators to stick to the NSCHD protocol efficiently, there has to be regular training, okay? And clearly more education on why it's important to use, okay? Any questions so far? So there's many factors that can impact suggestibility, right? What we've mainly focused on so far are external factors. So these include leading questions. Of course, they can lead the child in the wrong direction, but also then can taint the child's future accounts, okay? As we saw in the mousetrap study and so on, and that wasn't even all that leading, but it was just frequently giving them this question. It can taint their subsequent narratives. Another issue is repeated questions, okay? If children are asked the same question several times, they might think, well, I gave the wrong answer before, I should change my answer, okay? Or they might think, I didn't answer before, I need to answer, I'll give an answer, okay? In both of those situations, the children are likely to give an inaccurate response, okay? Thinking that they're complying with the wishes of the investigator, doing what the investigator wants them to do. Now, what we find in research is that if we warn investigators not to repeat questions, they don't repeat them verbatim, but they still repeat them in some other way. They repeat the gist of the question, or they'll rephrase the question. So in their minds, they're not verbatim asking the same question in the exact same way, but they've maybe changed it from directive to more open-ended, or open-ended to more directive, or they've, you know, reconstructed the question in some way, but the gist of the question is still the same. What we find is that no matter what the type of repeated question is, whether it's verbatim repetition or just repetition and so on, it's still likely to be problematic, okay? The same problems arise, okay, with children who didn't answer before, now answering incorrectly, or children changing their answer from one that was correct to one that's now inaccurate. The best buffer against this would be explaining to the child, I didn't understand, or I didn't hear you correctly, okay? I'm not asking you the same question, okay, because I want you to change your answer, okay? I just want to be more clear, okay, on what it is that you meant, okay? Something along those lines. Another issue that can be problematic is repeated interviews, as we saw in the mousetrap study, right? From just having those 10 interviews, the idea that their hand was stuck in a mousetrap became more salient, more familiar, until they actually became convinced it was true. And this was without the presence of particularly leading questions. Now, repeated interviews can be beneficial if all the details being discussed are accurate and if there's no suggestive questions. It can help, you know, solidify the memory, strengthen the memory in the child's mind, okay? But only so long as best practice is being used and the details being discussed are accurate. If inaccurate details are being discussed, then the child will become convinced in many cases that these are accurate details. Or if the questions are suggestive, we're increasing the probability that suggestion will influence the child's account. Another impact is delay. Memory declines over time, even more so for children. So children should be interviewed as quickly as possible after the crime, okay, rather than having a large duration. And then, of course, interviewer bias can also be problematic, which is something we talked about with false confessions, okay? Because it's more likely to cause interrogative type approaches. You know, in the daycare cases, many of these investigators believed that this person was guilty, okay? And were looking for evidence just to go hand in hand with their account, okay? Whereas to get to the truth of the matter, the investigators should be challenging these to an extent, or at least exploring possible alternative explanations, okay, rather than only looking for what they want to hear, okay, or asking questions that will bring about information they want to hear, Okay, the question should be more open-ended in general. Stereotype induction, as we saw in the Sam Stone study, when the children believed that this person coming to the room was clumsy, then they were more likely to come up with these stories, these inventive stories of the person being clumsy. In the daycare cases, many times they had this idea that this was a bad person being discussed, and then more likely to come up with bad things that this person has done. Interviewer status, likely only to be an issue if the investigator uses it in a kind of way to get what they want. So, for example, in the daycare cases, investigators would sometimes say, well, I'm an important policeman, you don't want to disappoint me. If you help me with this investigation, you can get a toy badge and you can be a policeman just like me, and so on. Okay, they're kind of manipulating the witness by using their status. Okay. And then emotional tone. Children are very perceptive when it comes to the reaction of the adults that they're talking to. And if they think the adult is, perking up when they hear what they want to hear, and their tone is becoming more positive and they're getting some non-verbal feedback that's encouraging, no, the child is more likely to go down that route further, telling the adult what they think the adult wants to hear. The investigator should be encouraging throughout, no matter what the child says. Okay, they should be positive in their emotional tone. If not that, then neutral. And they should be encouraging in their body language and approach, no matter what the child says. And, in many cases, that's what happened in the daycare cases, right? The children were picking up on the fact that this is what the investigator wants to hear, so I'll give them more information in line with this. And, children have amazing imaginations, right? Which is how they were able to come up with some of the stories that they came up with in those daycare cases. These bizarre details about underground tunnels to farms and seas of sharks and the satanic shapes and all the other things that were being brought up, right? Many children are afraid of the dark, and you can only be afraid of the dark if you have an imagination that's capable of filling that darkness with monsters and things to be frightened of, right? With the time we have left, I want to tell you about a case, the case of Jimmy Gard. And then if there's time, I'll give you some questions to work on. If not, we can do it next time. So this is in Provo, Utah in 2004. There's a 9-year-old girl. She's just off the bus and she's walking home from the bus stop to her house. And then a man grabs her from behind, okay? But she manages to wriggle free, okay? According to her, she kicks him in the shin and then pokes him several times in the eye. That's her initial account. When she's interviewed by the news later, she kind of exaggerates and exaggerates until eventually she tells the story of beating up this almost kidnapper. Okay, but let's focus for now on just this initial account to police. So she goes home and tells police, or tells her family rather, her mother, that she was nearly abducted. Some strange man nearly picked her up off the streets. So they call the police, and the responding officer is Officer Becerra. Now, Officer Becerra has no formal training in interviewing children. She has no experience with the formats and guidance. But as responding officers often do, she responds by interviewing the witness. And so she asks CM to describe the almost kidnapper. She describes someone who is Hispanic, who has dark hair, facial hair, who wore white shoes, a black baseball cap, wore jeans, and wore a black t-shirt with the wrestler Steve Austin on the front, okay? These are very elaborate details, more than we would expect from typical research. Maybe a good memory, maybe imagination, maybe discussing this with the parents before the officer arrived, okay? Especially, the picture of Steve Austin, maybe describing a wrestler, and then maybe the father asking on his phone, right, is this the person who was on the t-shirt or something such as that. Detective Jensen then is the detective assigned to the case. He does have some experience in interviewing child witnesses, and so he's a bit more careful to build rapport with CM before doing the interview. He's not following the NSHD protocol, but it's just some kind of general advice, if you like, from the research, like building rapport and asking open-ended questions, avoiding suggestive questions. The details are pretty much the same, okay? Some additional details: that the baseball cap had the letter A on it, that he was chubby or overweight, that he had afro hair. And then Detective Jensen says, was he taller or shorter than me? CM says shorter. Detective Jensen 6'1". Officer Becerra, was she taller or shorter? Shorter. She's 5'7", so that means the kidnapper is somewhere between 5'7" and 6'1". Now, Detective Jensen was thought of a nearby incident of a case in which there was a man who was not charged or anything, but was a person of interest. And so the next day he visited CM with this person's photo and gave CM a photo array. It was a sequential lineup showing one photo at a time, okay? 6 photos, 5 known innocents, 5 fillers, and then he's the third one. First photo, do you recognize this person? No. Second one, do you recognize this person? No. Third picture of Jimmy Guard. Yes, that was him. Okay. Fourth picture, no, don't recognize. Fifth, no. Sixth, no. Okay. So a fairly immediate response, identification. So based upon this, Detective Jensen gets a search warrant of Jimmy Guard's house, but finds none of the clothes that CM describes, not the t-shirt. The only running shoes he has are blue. There's no white shoes, even though that's what she described. Can't find any evidence from pictures or conversations with neighbors or anything that he's ever worn any of these clothes that CM describes. He then canvasses the area for other witnesses, asking neighbors and so on if they saw anything. He asks about a dozen people, and 3 of them say that they found something, that they saw something. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry, the other witnesses are on the next slide. Let me come back to that in a moment. Okay. So Jimmy Guard, after this identification, is interviewed. He's maintaining his innocence, and Detective Jensen says, if you pass a polygraph, we'll drop the charges. Okay. Or rather, won't charge you. He does pass the polygraph, but in fact, he'll still be charged with the crime. He claimed to have an alibi. He said he went to a library frequently, and that he was served that day at the coffee stand in the library by a red-haired and Irish-looking barista, and that she might remember him because he had dropped several lids. Detective Jensen says that he went there, he found no red-haired barista, and no evidence that Jimmy Guard was ever there. But Jimmy Guard maintains that's still the case, so he hires a private investigator to prove the matter. The PI, quite immediately, is able to find this red-haired barista at the library's coffee shop, and she does remember the incident of a customer who dropped these lids and so on. He goes through the video footage. He finds someone who seems to match Jimmy Guard's description. He's wearing the same clothes that Jimmy Guard said he wore that day. It's at the time in which Jimmy Guard said he was there. But the video surveillance is not the best, and so it's kind of up for debate somewhat whether it's really Jimmy Guard or not. Conveniently, for the investigation at least, this footage was accidentally deleted by the time of trial. Out of the about 12 people who were interviewed, 3 of them are potentially helpful to the prosecutor's case. 3 witnesses here. The first witness is a 10-year-old girl who's friends with CM. She was further down the street when the incident occurred, and so she says that she saw the struggle between CM and the adult. She was too far away to see him clearly, but she was able to describe his clothes, that he was wearing blue pants, just like CM said, a black t-shirt and a cap, just like CM said, and white shoes, just like CM said. Okay. Detective Jensen showed her Jimmy Guard's photo and said, is this the person? But the girl said she didn't know. She was too far away to see his face. We have a 49-year-old neighbor who says, yes, he saw something suspicious that day. He saw a Hispanic man standing by a group of girls at a bus stop. And when they left the bus stop, he seemed to follow them. Detective Jensen showed this man Jimmy Gard's photo. Was this the man you saw? And the 49-year-old neighbor says that yes, that was the person he saw across the street with this group of girls. And then we have a 39-year-old neighbor who says, yes, she saw something that day. She saw a man run by her house window, and it was at the time, roughly, of the incident. Jimmy Gard is shown in a photo. There's no photo array, by the way. Okay, it's just one photo. Did you see this person? Is this the person? And she says, not sure, but it could have been. Okay. So the evidence at trial is CM's testimony, who's the primary witness, and then these other three witnesses who are kind of secondary witnesses who maybe help, give credibility to CM's story. And he is convicted, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Okay. CM's testimony at trial is pretty much the same, except she says that the shoes worn by the man were blue, okay, rather than white. She said white in both the interview with Officer Becerra and in the interview with Detective Jensen, and the friend also said white, but somewhat conveniently, it's now changed to the same color of shoes that police found in his house. Jimmy Gard's defense argues that there should be a psychologist who has expertise in eyewitness research, giving some information to the jury on problems that can arise from eyewitness testimony, some of the factors that impact it, and so on. But the judge denies this request. He refers to a ruling from the state of Utah versus Ramirez in 1991 that said an eyewitness testimony should be reliable or should be accepted as reliable if these 5 conditions are met. First of all, having the opportunity to view the defendant, having a good degree of attention during the event, having the capacity to observe and recall, making the identification spontaneously, not the product of suggestion, and the event must be of one in nature that would make it memorable. Okay. And the judge's decision is, so long as these 5 conditions are met, then eyewitness testimony is reliable and there's no need for any instructions to the jury or any testimony from an expert. And you can infer from that that the judge's idea here is that if the conditions were not met, the testimony wouldn't be reliable and so wouldn't be admissible. So under no circumstances, really, according to this judge, would there be an expert on this topic. Okay, what I want you to do is consider the question of whether you could be confident that Jimmy Gard is guilty and what evidence would point in that direction. And then what evidence or arguments would make you skeptical that he's guilty? And then lastly, do you think expert testimony should have been allowed? Okay, and I'll give you time in small groups, okay, to discuss these questions, and then I'll see what you think, and I'll come around as well. Okay. Anything else? I mean, the fact that the other witnesses were only given one picture to choose from is highly problematic, right? The fact that the PI found evidence of the alibi and so on. Right, let me tell you how this case concluded, okay? So, it was in 2004. He's up for parole in 10 years. But condition of parole is that you have to be sorry for what you did, and he still maintained his innocence. So parole then was denied. He finally got parole in 2019, okay? This case is in the book I was telling you about, and I did interview him after his release to see kind of what his thoughts were now on the case. So I asked him, you've served 15 years, would you still have pled not guilty if you were to go back? And he said, yes, there was no other choice in this case. I had never seen CM before. He was 9 years old at the time, until she was introduced to court, and I saw her then for the first time. Do you still maintain, I asked, that you were at the library in Salt Lake City at the time in question? He says, yes, I was in Salt Lake City at the public library on that day. A private detective was hired. and that was established in a security video at the library that was subsequently erased by the library's employees under suspicious circumstances, and I took a polygraph regarding my involvement. You know, I already had the court records of this case, but I got much more from Jimmy Garrett. He gave me everything his lawyers had. He gave me the results of the polygraph test and everything else that the defense had collected. And he was told, you know, if he passed the polygraph, then the charges would be dropped. And despite passing with flying colors, they never were. I asked him if he thought the expert would have changed anything. He says, I feel that Dr. David Dodd was a well-qualified expert. His testimony may have made the difference. I was picked out from a lineup. Dr. Dodd has written extensively on this. In fact, he had been the expert witness for the state of Utah on numerous cases. And, you know, he says that he felt as though he did precisely all that was required of a person who was wrongly accused of a crime. The outcome is an indication that even when the accused does everything right, the outcome may still be wrong. He is of the opinion that there is some degree of bad faith on the part of the investigators. The attorney initially dispatched the investigator who arrested him to verify the alibi, and the investigator came back with negative findings with the alibi altogether, indicating that he was lying, but the PI was able to come back with very different results very, very quickly. He served a 15-year sentence. It was 2020 when he was out on parole, and he's registered as a kidnap offender on the sex offender registry for the rest of his life. And his family have also hired a private investigator to reach out to CM once he was released and to interview her a bit more about the photo array, hoping to clear his name, that she's subsequently been incarcerated for a crime. And her lawyers won't allow any private investigators to talk to her. Okay. And so that's where the case is currently at. Okay. Okay, afternoon, everyone. So I have a final chapter, if you like, on child witnesses. And then probably with the kind of second half of today's class, we'll do an activity that will give you extra credit. Okay. So we've talked a lot about how external factors can impact suggestibility, like different questions that an investigator may ask and so on. And the last part to consider is the individual differences, the internal, if you like, predictors of suggestibility. Now, the clearest one is age. Okay, younger children are more suggestible than older children. That's a pretty robust finding. It's the best predictor when it comes to suggestibility differences in children. It's the factor that explains most of the variance when we look at individual differences. The next is cognitive factors. Okay, so this would be memory abilities, IQ, language abilities. Okay, these are the next best predictors over differences in suggestibility within children. Okay, if you have a better memory, you're going to be more confident, you're going to be less suggestible. If you have more words to express yourself with and understand more words, you're going to be less suggestible. We talked about that already. An IQ, that those children with a higher IQ are less suggestible than those with a lower IQ. But the difference really only comes from explaining, or rather when comparing a child who's at the level of intellectual impairments and a child with at least average IQ. If we're dealing with other comparisons, it's explaining much less of the variance. And then, to a lesser extent, attachment also plays a role. Children with a more insecure attachment style, okay, more suggestible than those with a more secure attachment style. Remember, if they're more anxious in their attachment style, maybe they're more likely to want to please the investigator, maybe they're less confident. Creativity explains some of the variance, at least. There's been about 4 studies that have looked at this. All of them found significant results, but all of them looked at children of a similar age, all about middle childhood. But from those studies, it does seem to be the case that children who are more creative and fantasy prone might be more accepting of false details through suggestion and implantation. And then lastly is temperament. The personality traits, the behavioral styles of the children, these also to an extent impact suggestibility. So This is just an example of how age doesn't always explain all of the variance. So what we have here is child A and child B. Both are taken to a fairground by a Confederate called Patrick. He takes them to a Ghostbusters themed haunted house, and he lays down on the ground next to them inside this haunted house. He never touches them at all, okay, during the entire scenario. But then afterwards, both of the children are given a series of suggestive questions about sexual touching, okay, to see if they can get to admit or disclose falsely that Patrick touched them, even though he didn't, okay. Now, these are just small extracts, okay? You can look at the original paper to see the full interview transcripts, okay? But what you'll see is that child A gives in almost immediately, okay? A little bit of peer pressure. Other kids said, Patrick touched them. Do you remember now? Nods head, yes, he did, okay? It doesn't take very much for this child to admit to something that didn't actually happen. Whereas child B is much more resistant, okay? And again, this is just one question. You can see the full transcript, but you'll see she denies the allegation again and again and again. And actually, by the end, she gets a bit frustrated with the investigator, okay? Because he's continually asking her something that she isn't going to agree to. Now, what's surprising here is that the girl was about 4 years of age, okay? And the boy is about 6, okay? So he's older and statistically should be less vulnerable to suggestion. But in this case, that's not what was happening because there's other variables at play, okay? Some children, because of their behavioral style and so on, are more compliant. They're more likely to give in to suggestions. They're less confident in themselves. And some children will stand their ground no matter what and will be more persistent over what actually happens, okay? On this point, let me just say, there's no sex difference, okay? Sometimes you might find falsely, okay, a statement that there is an observed sex difference in boys and girls in suggestibility. But if you trace the evidence back, there haven't been any significant findings since the 1950s, okay? Yes, it was true during the first few decades of the 20th century. It was reliably found in suggestibility studies that girls were more vulnerable to suggestion than boys, okay? But since the studies then began being completed again in the 1970s, there's been no significant sex difference found since, okay? This may be because of the differences in gender roles in society, right? If you imagine in the early 1900s, right, a young girl who's being interviewed by a male researcher, they might be more socially compliant, okay, than, you know, a boy of the same age would be. But for the last few decades, okay, there's no significant difference in any of the studies. In my own research, not only is there no significant difference, but the p-value is typically higher than 0.95, okay, which means that with almost absolute certainty, there is no difference, okay, between the two groups. So if talking about behavioral styles having an impact, okay, what we're focusing on here is temperament. And, you know, these are the main kind of temperament traits that are studied in children and the ones that have been used in the eyewitness literature because they've been found to be relevant. Now, some of these likely impact the child's encoding, you know, how much they're paying attention to what's happening, and some likely impact the retrieval, you know, during the interview, and some might impact both, okay? But activity, so if the child is hyperactive, okay, then quite often they remember less than children who are less in the active spectrum. So that might be because they're not quite as much paying attention to what's happening as the event's unfolding. Emotionality is a more difficult one. For the most part, it seems to be that more emotional children, okay, perform worse as eyewitnesses than those who are less emotional. But there's some exceptions to that, okay? Keep in mind that we already looked at the fact that stress plays a role. You know, a degree of stress has you pay attention, and then there comes a point in which you're overwhelmed, okay? And your typical emotionality is going to have an impact on what that threshold is. So what I mean by emotionality is the intensity of a child's emotions, right? All children will get upset from time to time, but those who are high in emotionality. You know, they cry with great intensity when they have temper tantrums, they're stomping their foot, they're screaming and yelling, they're going red-faced. They're very, very difficult to, you know, console or to calm down. Okay, that would be the children high in this. You know, children who are high in activity are the children who can't keep still, who are always getting out of their chair, who are always fidgeting, who are always kind of bouncing up and down or moving when they're sitting down. Persistence is pretty broad in its definition. You know, the extent to which a child will persist with a challenging task and also with a frame of mind even when challenged. What the research suggests is that children who are more persistent are less vulnerable to suggestive questions, are more likely to stand their ground, more likely to say no to misleading questions, okay, if they're higher in persistence. Adaptability is about social flexibility, if you like, how easily one adapts to changes in settings, changes in routine. It seems that children who are higher in adaptability perform better as eyewitnesses, are less suggestible. And then shyness, you know, a fear of social judgment, right? Degree of anxiety in social situations. It seems that children who are higher in shyness perform more vulnerable to leading questions. Okay, they're more likely to agree to leading questions than less shy children. But also interestingly, there's an interaction effect here. Okay, investigators' approach will differ depending upon the temperament of the children, meaning that if they're dealing with a more shy child, they're more likely to ask leading questions. Okay, so it's not just the case that the children are more vulnerable to these types of questions, but they're more likely to be asked these questions as well. You know, if an investigator has a child who they view as somewhat challenging, who isn't the most vocal or the most talkative, and who they're finding it difficult to get information from, they might try to take the lead more than they would in a typical situation. They might try to, you know, prompt that child and try to push them down the right path more so than a typical child. And then lastly is distractibility. So how easily a child's attention is diverted, okay? So by distractions in the background and so on. Now, in part, this could be during the encoding that this impacts, again, maybe paying attention less to the event, but certainly during retrieval as well. You know, some children in police interviews cannot keep still, okay? And the investigator cannot keep their attention on the task at hand. You know, they're getting off the chair and running around to the interview room, and they're going underneath the table, okay? And they're difficult, okay, for the investigator to really control. So obviously, unsurprisingly, distractible children typically give less information as eyewitnesses than less distractible children. I'll tell you a little bit about some of my research that I've done. For my doctoral research, I interviewed myself over 200 children across Scotland, and what this included was giving them a video to watch of a non-violent bike theft. Okay, the boy comes and steals the girl's bike. And then I followed the NICHD protocol by interviewing all of these children afterwards and what they remembered. You know, the same rule explaining, rapport building, and so on, the same free invitation, tell me what happened. The only thing that was different was the follow-up questions. Okay, so some children are given more open-ended follow-ups, some close-ended follow-ups, and some leading follow-ups to see the impact of these question types. So, for example, if they hadn't said in free recall who the bike belonged to, then this might be a follow-up question. You know, open-ended, tell me who the bike belonged to. Close-ended, did the bike belong to the girl or the boy, giving them a choice. And then misleading would be, the bike belonged to the boy, didn't it? Even though it actually belonged to the girl. Okay. And just in terms of how this was coded, you know, because some responses are more elaborate than others. So, you know, if they were talking about the girl's shoes, they could tell me she was wearing trainers and that they were white, which would be an elaborate response, or they could be a partial response. And then there could be a mix, right, of correct details and incorrect details. They could be right about the shoe type, but wrong about the color, or vice versa. So there's three things being measured, you know, correct details, incorrect details, and then overall accuracy. So unsurprising, you know, those in the misleading condition gave less correct details than those in the open-ended or close-ended conditions. Those in the misleading gave significantly more incorrect details than either of the other two groups. And also those in the close-ended group gave significantly more incorrect details than those in the open-ended group. Again, not surprising. Okay, we know that close-ended questions increase the chances that they'll answer, but quite often these answers are incorrect. We know the damaging effects of misleading questions. Again, a significant difference between every group for overall accuracy. In the open-ended group, about 85% of what they told me in the interview was correct. In the close-ended, between 75 and 80%. In the misleading group, just over 60% of what they told me was correct in the interview. Now, these are not interesting, really, or surprising findings because they've been well replicated. What I really wanted to investigate was the role of temperament, okay, for measuring these temperament traits and seeing how that might have an impact. So overall, regardless of what question type was asked, those who were more distractible provided more incorrect details and less correct details, were less accurate overall, okay? Regardless of what questions I asked. If they were more distractible, they told me less, okay? The other findings are only related to the misleading condition, okay? So only if misleading questions were asked, then those who were higher in adaptability and higher in persistence gave more correct details, okay? So they were more resistant to the misleading questions, okay? And then those lower in adaptability and distractibility gave more errors, okay? So overall less accurate, more vulnerable to being misled by the misleading questions. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the questions about how I measured temperament, I constructed a self-report, okay, from having the children then give their own answers. And this was matched to having the parents fill out a temperament questionnaire on the behavioral styles of the children. And then I gave them a series of tasks also to make sure that was in agreement. So distractibility, for example, they had to press the key in response to a certain thing on the screen. They did it when there was no distraction. Again, when there was a distraction, comparing reaction time to see how easily distracted they were. Persistence was a wooden puzzle that's really quite challenging to see if they would give up or whether they would persist and continue with it. So there's 3 different measures of temperament. So overall conclusions, children who are less adaptable to new environments might experience greater difficulty when given misleading questions, might feel more compelled to give answers, might feel less comfortable to correct the investigator. And then those who are more distractible, provide less information, probably because they encoded less, maybe also because they're more distracted during retrieval. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Is that just in the misleading question category?
Exactly, yeah. So distractibility affected across the board, okay, regardless of what question type was asked. Adaptability and persistence only mattered in the presence of misleading questions, okay? And the other conditions, it had no effect. Yeah. My hope from this research and other similar studies is not that this will be used to screen out certain children. It's not the case that if a child is distractible or shy or whatever, that they should then be, unallowed from giving testimony. The hope here is that investigators will tailor their approach, that accommodations can be made, okay, to have the interview better suit a child based upon their temperament. Exactly what system variables need to be changed still needs to be investigated. But for example, children with ADHD do better on schoolwork if given a series of short breaks, okay? So it might be the case in a police interview, again, if highly distractible children are given a number of breaks, then maybe overall they'll perform better and provide more information. If, less adaptable children feel less comfortable then maybe having less environmental changes to adapt to, having the interview in their bedroom or having their favorite toy to play with during the interview or something like that. So that means that they maybe feel more comfortable. Again, exactly what needs to be changed needs to be investigated, okay? But these are some suggestions. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, persistence is being tied to a protective factor against suggestive questions. Maybe it also has a role to play if, for example, the perpetrator tells them not to say anything to police. I don't know about that. That would be quite hard to test, I guess. You could do kind of like the breaking the laptop experiment we talked about, right? To see if children would disclose that or not, see if persistence has a role to play. And it could do, yeah, hard to know. Again, persistence is such a broad trait, really, in its definition. I will play a video from this study for you next time, okay? I thought it was on my drive, but it's not, so I'll have it next time. Just to show you some of the interviews with the children or some moments. So kind of lastly, just to talk about how children are regarded as witnesses, okay, in the courtroom. Now I'm going to talk about juries separately next anyway, and we'll talk about how, factors impact perceptions that juries have. But just to give you an idea maybe of how children are perceived, there's still this fear, of course, that, if you have only a child's word to rely upon, then many people might be skeptical over this, okay? In many cases of child sexual abuse, their testimony is the only evidence. In such cases, prosecutors only go ahead about a third of the time, okay, with a trial. Factors that make it more likely the prosecutor will go ahead are if a medical examination was done by a specialist staff member, so a sexual assault nurse examiner, for example. If there's some further evidence, like maybe a witness who can help support some parts of the child's testimony, or of course, if maybe the defendant has confessed. But also if the child victim is older, okay, rather than younger, then it's viewed that they might be more of a credible witness. Remember, we've looked at the fact already that eyewitness testimony is one of the most persuading factors for juries, okay? Even though accuracy and confidence aren't always in line, okay? And in fact, the correlation is even weaker, okay, for child witnesses, okay? So a confident child witness doesn't necessarily mean an accurate child witness, okay? And in fact, there is an overconfidence that's been reported in boys around 10 years of age, okay, that seems to exist across studies, that their confidence is maybe a bit inflated regardless of their actual memory. Leading questions can further decrease confidence or perceived confidence according to juries, okay? So if a lawyer in cross-examination maybe asks a child a leading question, then the jury might think, did they answer that in that way because it was the correct answer, or did they answer it that way because the question was leading, okay? The jury can have less confidence in the credibility of the witness as a result of this. And then, to an extent, emotionality may also play a role. In this paper, a child witness who was crying on the stand when giving testimony was more persuasive, and so the jury gave more guilty verdicts than if the child wasn't crying, okay? But this is likely to depend upon the case in question, the crime in question, maybe other characteristics of the child, and so on. But maybe in some cases, this could also play a role. In regards to the factors to do with the jury themselves, female jurors are more sympathetic to victim witnesses, including child witnesses and really all types of sexual assault victims, okay? perhaps because women are more likely to be sexually assaulted themselves. But also empathy seems to predict having greater belief in the credibility of the child witness. And on average, women score higher in empathy than men do. Now, juror age has been largely ignored by the literature. Not really any findings, particularly in regard to child victims, but more broadly, some evidence to suggest that older jurors are more skeptical over sexual assault claims than younger jurors are. So I began last week by asking the question, are children reliable witnesses? Okay. My answer is that yes, they can be, so long as certain steps are followed. Okay. Obviously, they can be reliable in some cases and unreliable in other cases. This has to be carefully scrutinized and looked at. But as a generalization, so long as certain steps are followed, okay, they can be reliable witnesses. Investigators, first of all, should avoid leading questions and close-ended questions, right? Because this might compel children to provide answers that they don't actually have, or even if they don't understand the question. And suggestive questions can taint their testimony and their future accounts, right? We saw that in the mousetrap studies. And, you know, the video I showed you ended with the grandfather saying that when his grandkids are older, they'll remember things as they actually happened, okay? But unfortunately, that's not what seems to be likely, okay? When we look at the children from the daycare cases, the paper in Los Angeles, is it the LA Times? They did a recent follow-up on the McMartin children. And what they found was a number of them still claimed to have been sexually abused, okay, all these years later, you know, talking over 3 decades at this point. And there was no actual independent sources of evidence other than the coerced claims of the children after a series of interrogations, right? I mean, some of these children were interrogated by police over 60 times before they actually made an accusation, okay? And, you know, I've told you about all the, you know, the claims that the children were making. Though I reminded myself over some of them recently by looking at one of the initial social worker interviews from the McMartin case with one of the children. And what she did was she thought the child would feel more comfortable if he had a hand puppet. It was an alligator, and she had, I think, a dog, and they were talking to each other rather than, you know, her talking to the child. And she was saying things like, so-and-so and so-and-so told me that they were playing this naked game at daycare. Do you remember this game? And then the boy responds, no, I don't remember that game. And then the social worker's response was, well, what good are you? You must be dumb, okay? Talking to the alligator, okay, the sock puppet. But what's the child going to think of that, right? And then she continues to grill him and continue to grill him. And then once he says something that is what she likes to hear, she then says something like, well, maybe you're not so dumb, okay? Maybe you're going to be helpful, okay? So clearly a really direct, okay, way of swaying his narrative. But yes, on that point, you know, the fact is that these children, even years and years later, still have this kind of inaccurate report over what happened. You know, many of these daycares were in, you know, city centers like LA. There were visitors fairly frequent. You know, parents would pop in and out at all odd times of the day, and no one ever saw anything, you know, remotely suspicious. Okay, and there was no ever physical medical evidence to back up any claims. And yes, sexual abuse doesn't always have physical evidence, but the reports that these children were given, there would certainly be, you know, scarring and lesions and tearing and so on that you would expect from what they were reporting. So we should avoid close-ended and leading questions. We should use a structured interview format, okay, such as the NICHD protocol. You know, that makes sure that rapport is built. There's this practice interview, best practice is followed. We're taking away the guesswork from the investigators. We should avoid repeating questions, okay, whether it's just repetition or verbatim. And perhaps also make accommodations based upon temperaments. You know, if a child is highly distractible or shy, you know, try to make them feel more comfortable, okay? rather than just asking more leading questions, okay, as the response. Avoiding delay by having children interviewed as quickly as possible after the event. And then avoiding external pressures, right? This would be, stereotype induction and interviewer bias and, emotional tone changing in response to what you want to hear, right? And all the other examples that we've looked at, the peer pressure and the promise of rewards if you give me what I want to hear. Lineup procedures should be followed closely. So this includes, the double-blind procedures that we talked about in the third module. Having the witness know that the suspect may or may not be in the lineup. And maybe also for children, the silhouette mystery card, right, which significantly reduces false identifications. And then, children shouldn't be undermined when giving testimony. The dangers over leading questions are well understood, but many lawyers still think it's an effective strategy for cross-examination, okay? But again, this will undermine the credibility, okay, according to the jury that the witness has. Is there any questions on children as witnesses?